Well, that came after we were talking about the film. They just have a book out on the thing.
Clint Eastwood has survived eras, scandals, and decades of Hollywood chaos without ever losing his footing. But lately, the ground beneath him seems less stable than ever. A private tragedy quietly reshaped his world, and soon after, subtle changes began to worry those closest to him. The timing couldn't have been worse. As one chapter of his career moved forward, a deeply personal family issue pulled him in the opposite direction. At 95 years old, the emotional toll was impossible to ignore. Friends feared isolation. Fans sensed something was wrong. And rumors began filling the silence he refused to address. For a man who built his reputation on strength and endurance, this moment feels different, more fragile, more uncertain. And it's why many are wondering if the weight has finally become too heavy. Trouble came long before stardom. Clint Eastwood was born in San Francisco in 1930, and for years he painted his childhood as one shaped by the hardship of the Great Depression. It made for a compelling origin story, the tough kid who came from nothing and clawed his way to the top. But according to his longtime partner Sandra Locke, that version of events was a little polished. She later suggested that his upbringing was far more comfortable than he liked to admit, complete with a nice home, a private pool, and 8 weekends at the country club. Of course, their relationship ended badly, so her account comes with its own baggage. Still, whether Clint grew up struggling or sheltered, one thing is clear: he was never an easy kid to manage. School did not come naturally to him. Math especially gave him trouble, and even after summer school, he was held back in junior high. Teachers tried to steer him toward sports and music, where he showed some promise, but nothing seemed to stick. He drifted from school to school, bored, restless, and mostly uninterested in academics. His attention was focused elsewhere, on cars, girls, and whatever felt exciting in the moment. He was also intensely private, even back then. That's one reason there's still no clear answer about whether he ever officially graduated high school. Friends from that era remembered him as someone far more invested in chasing fun than earning a diploma. And as is often the case, chasing fun had a way of leading him into trouble. One of those moments happened during his first visit to Carmel by the Sea, the same town he would later fall in love with, move to, and eventually serve as mayor. When he arrived there as a young man, he reportedly said that one day he wanted to live there. In that sense, Carmel became a dream fulfilled. But the first trip itself was anything but peaceful. While there, he became involved with a local school teacher who was older than him. What he saw as something casual quickly turned intense and unsettling. The woman became deeply attached and reportedly threatened to harm herself if he left. Faced with a situation he wasn't equipped to handle, Clint chose to walk away. It was a moment that hinted at a pattern, emotional chaos left behind, even before fame entered the picture. Not long after, he ran into a very different kind of consequence. Despite having no interest in military life, he was drafted into the Army and stationed at Fort Ord in California. And during his service, he experienced one of the most terrifying events of his life. On a flight from Seattle back to base, everything went wrong. The aircraft suffered multiple system failures. The hatch wouldn't stay closed, oxygen failed, communication systems went dark, and finally the plane ran out of fuel. With no other option, the pilot ditched the aircraft into the Pacific Ocean, several miles from shore. Hours earlier, Clint had been enjoying a carefree visit with a girlfriend. Now he was plunging into freezing, storm-tossed water, fighting to survive. The plane bounced violently on impact before beginning to sink. There was no time to think, only time to move. Clint and the crew jumped into the ocean and began swimming toward the distant coastline. The water was bitterly cold, the waves were rough, and darkness was falling fast. Clint had one advantage. He was a strong swimmer, having worked as a swimming instructor during his service. That skill likely saved his life. He later recalled seeing the faint outline of the Golden Gate Bridge before the storm clouds swallowed everything. At the time, he believed they were swimming an impossible distance, though it was likely only a mile or two. Unbeknownst to them, they were swimming through a known shark breeding area, a detail Clint later said he was grateful not to know in the moment. The group became separated in the waves, and for a time, everyone feared the worst. But one by one, they all reached shore alive. They survived. After finishing his service, Clint moved to Los Angeles and soon met a woman who seemed different from the rest. Her name was Margaret Neville Johnson, known as Maggie, and after only a few months of dating, they married. For a brief moment, it looked like he might finally settle down, but distance quickly reopened old habits. While Maggie stayed behind to finish her studies, Clint took work in Seattle, and there, he became involved with another woman. That brief relationship resulted in the birth of a daughter named Lori in 1954. Clint never knew about her. Lori's mother gave the baby up for adoption without telling him, and Lori grew up unaware of her famous biological father. It wasn't until she was in her 30s, searching for her roots, that she discovered the truth, that her father was one of the most recognizable figures in film history. It's a twist that feels almost cinematic in itself. The global icon, the secret child, the truth revealed decades later. The face Hollywood didn't believe in. Clint Eastwood had one of those faces that seemed to unlock doors without him even trying. In the early 1950s, that face just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Universal Pictures came to Fort Ord to shoot a film, and while the crew was setting up, a cameraman noticed a tall, quiet soldier wandering nearby. He pointed him out to the director, Arthur Lubin, who took one look and agreed. That guy belonged on a screen. And just like that, without an agent, without training, and without any plan to become an actor, Clint Eastwood was handed his first audition. It sounded like a fairy tale, but the reality was far less glamorous. When Clint finally stood in front of the camera, the magic vanished. He was stiff, nervous, and awkward. The performance fell flat. Lubin's feedback was polite but honest. He needed acting classes. Still, for reasons that went beyond logic or talent, Lubin signed him to a contract anyway. It paid little, but it was a foot in the door. And in Hollywood, that meant everything. From the outside, it looked like luck. From the inside, it was the start of a long, bruising grind. Clint began auditioning constantly. Film after film rejected him. Directors told him he was wooden, unconvincing, and forgettable. He failed auditions for romantic leads, for comedies, for dramas, for anything he could get in front of. The rejections stacked up, and so did the self-doubt. At one point, his biggest role at Universal was playing a scarecrow in a Christmas show for studio employees' children. It was humbling, but instead of quitting, Clint leaned in. He took classes. He practiced. He watched other actors and studied what worked. Slowly, something clicked. He discovered that he could tap into anger with unusual intensity. When he played it, people believed it. It was raw, unsettling, and real. That emotional edge became the foundation of his screen presence. Off-screen, he was already developing the tough guy reputation that would later define him. One night in Los Angeles, Clint and his friends were confronted by armed men outside a restaurant. While everyone else froze, Clint didn't flinch. He stared them down, unafraid, and the would-be attackers backed off. On another occasion, a group of sailors picked a fight with him at a bar, assuming he was an easy target. They quickly learned otherwise. Clint walked away bruised but standing. The legend was growing before the fame ever arrived. But his personal life was far messier than his public image suggested. His marriage to Maggie was already unraveling. Fidelity was never his strong suit, and as his acting career picked up, so did the number of affairs. Some were brief, others lasted years. One relationship with a stunt woman named Roxanne Tunis became a long-running secret that everyone on the Rawhide set seemed to know about. In 1964, she gave birth to his daughter, Kimber. By the time Clint was barely 30, he had already fathered children outside his marriage and left behind a trail of complicated relationships. And yet, professionally, he was finally getting what he had worked toward. In 1959, he landed the role of Rowdy Yates on the television Western Rawhide. That was the turning point. The show made him a star. Millions of people saw his face every week. The paycheck was steady. The recognition was real. He had made it. But success didn't bring peace. Clint quickly grew frustrated with the role. He didn't like playing a cheerful, obedient sidekick. He wanted darker characters, sharper edges, more control. As the seasons went on, he became restless, irritable, and increasingly difficult on set. He arrived late, He disengaged. He treated the work like an obligation instead of an opportunity. The thing that saved him financially had begun to suffocate him creatively. Still, Rawhide did what no amount of luck or rejection ever could. It made him visible. It gave him leverage. It turned him from a struggling unknown into someone who could choose his next move. And that was exactly what he was waiting for. By the early 1960s, Clint Eastwood was no longer chasing a career. He was hunting for an escape from the role that trapped him, from the image that didn't fit him, and from the version of himself he was ready to outgrow. So when an unusual offer came his way, one that many actors would have dismissed outright, Clint didn't hesitate. He said yes. When everything finally clicked. While Clint Eastwood was grinding through his years on Rawhide, frustrated and boxed in by the role of Rowdy Yates, something interesting was happening around him. His co-stars were getting real movie offers, serious opportunities. And that's how Clint first heard whispers about a strange little Western being filmed far from Hollywood, out in the dusty countryside of Spain. The project sounded risky, even ridiculous. It was being directed by an unknown Italian filmmaker named Sergio Leone. Leone initially wanted Eastwood's Rawhide co-star Eric Fleming to play the lead. Fleming didn't hesitate. He laughed it off. Leaving Hollywood to shoot a Western in Spain with some unfamiliar European director felt like career suicide. Eastwood saw it differently. He was desperate to break free from television and reinvent himself. Being Rowdy Yates was starting to feel like a dead end. So when the offer came, he took it without blinking. That decision would change everything. Clint earned just $15,000 for 11 weeks of work on the film, which would eventually be titled A Fistful of Dollars. He also received a Mercedes-Benz as a bonus. At the time, the movie wasn't considered prestigious. Many actors might have buried it on their resume. Eastwood didn't care. He finally got to play a hard-edged anti-hero, the kind of character he had always believed suited him. What he couldn't have known was that this low-budget gamble would launch one of the most iconic trilogies in film history. The spaghetti westerns took a few years to catch on in the United States, but when they did, they redefined the genre, and Clint Eastwood along with it. By the late 1960s, Eastwood was no longer just a TV cowboy. He was a movie star. One of his biggest projects during that period was Paint Your Wagon, a musical western starring Lee Marvin and Gene Seberg. The production moved to Oregon, and so did Temptation. Both Eastwood and Seberg were married at the time, but that didn't stop them from starting an affair on set. Seberg fell deeply in love. So deeply, in fact, that she told her husband, novelist Romain Gary, that she was leaving him for Clint. Gary's reaction was dramatic even by Hollywood standards. Instead of quietly consulting a lawyer, he reportedly challenged Eastwood to a duel. The confrontation never happened, but the situation spiraled quickly. According to accounts later shared by film historian Karina Longworth, Gary eventually walked away. Seberg immediately contacted her publicist, frantic to announce her divorce and eager to start a new life with Clint. What she didn't know was that Eastwood didn't feel the same way. While he was seeing Seberg, he was also involved with another woman on the very same set. For him, it was just another affair. For Seberg, it was everything. When filming ended and they returned to Los Angeles, Eastwood effectively disappeared from her life. The emotional fallout was devastating. Those close to Seberg later said she was shattered by how easily he detached. The experience left lasting scars at a time when she was already emotionally vulnerable. Professionally, however, Eastwood was unstoppable. By the early 1970s, Dirty Harry arrived, and with it, a complete transformation. The clean-cut television cowboy vanished. In his place stood Clint Eastwood, the hardened screen icon. At home, things looked more settled, at least on the surface. His wife, Maggie Johnson, had endured years of infidelity. But after the success of the spaghetti westerns, Clint seemed calmer. They had been separated, yet decided to try again. They recommitted to the marriage and started a family. Their son Kyle was born in 1968, followed by their daughter Allison in 1972. For a moment, it may have felt like Clint had finally grown up, but that illusion didn't last long. In 1971, with one child at home and another on the way, Eastwood casually described his marriage in an interview as somewhat open. It was a telling phrase. Maggie had spent years looking the other way, convincing herself that his affairs didn't threaten their bond. But this time was different. Around the time Allison was born, Clint met a young actress named Sondra Locke. When their relationship truly began is unclear, but by 1975 they were living together. Clint assured her his marriage was effectively over, and she believed him. What started as another affair quickly became something deeper. Eastwood was captivated. Locke later recalled that Clint seemed stunned by how much he needed her. He told her he had never been faithful before because he had never truly been in love. The intensity was real, but so were the warning signs. Locke moved into the Sherman Oaks house Clint had purchased with Maggie, who was still very much his wife. Maggie had relocated to Pebble Beach, but her presence lingered. Locke never felt at home there. Eventually, she and Clint moved, hoping for a clean slate, but the shadow of his marriage followed them. Maggie soon realized this relationship wasn't temporary. She drew firm boundaries. Locke was restricted in her access to the children and barred entirely from the Pebble Beach property. It was humiliating and isolating, but it was also the reality of being involved with a married man. The strain only grew. According to Locke, Clint was deeply controlling when it came to contraception. Both of them distrusted traditional birth control methods, and she was eventually sent to learn the rhythm method. It failed, twice. By the late 1970s, Locke had undergone 2 abortions before deciding to have her tubes tied. The decision wasn't easy. She later admitted to moments of regret, imagining the children they might have had, but that future never materialized. In 1978, Maggie Johnson reached her limit. After 25 years of marriage, she filed for legal separation. She could tolerate affairs, but she could not ignore the fact that Clint was now emotionally committed to someone else. The divorce dragged on and ended with a settlement reportedly costing Eastwood tens of millions of dollars. For the first time, Clint was legally free, but there was one complication that had always been quietly ignored. Sondra Locke was married too. Her husband was Gordon Anderson, a gay man who had been her closest friend since childhood. Their marriage was a cover, a practical solution in a less accepting era. Clint knew the truth and even purchased a home for Anderson. Publicly, Clint and Sondra claimed they didn't need marriage to validate their relationship. In hindsight, that belief would come back to haunt them. Eastwood's inner circle could see how deeply involved he was. His longtime friend and producing partner, Fritz Maines, described Clint as utterly devoted to Locke during those years. But devotion in Clint's world came with exceptions. Even while treating Locke as the center of his emotional life, he maintained other relationships on the side, including ongoing involvement with Roxanne Tunis, the mother of one of his children. It was complicated, messy, and unsustainable. And then there was Fritz Maines. Maines had stood beside Eastwood for decades, helping build his career and producing some of his biggest films. Their partnership seemed unbreakable, until it wasn't. While working on Heartbreak Ridge, Maines received a call from Eastwood's secretary. He was fired. No conversation, no explanation. When Maines rushed to the studio, he discovered the locks on his office had been changed. His belongings were piled outside near a dumpster. That was the end. The friendship never recovered. They never spoke again. The moment everything fell apart. The first real crack in the foundation of Clint Eastwood and Sondra Locke's relationship appeared right after Maggie Johnson filed for divorce. With his marriage officially over, Clint felt free to move forward, and this time, he wanted marriage again. Sondra, however, wasn't ready to follow him there. She was still legally married to Gordon Anderson, and she had no intention of rushing into another commitment without serious thought. Sondra loved Clint, but she wasn't blind to who he was. By then, Eastwood had a reputation as a man who resisted being tied down. She feared that marriage would only end in heartbreak, so she drew a line in the sand. She would divorce her husband, but only if Clint agreed to couples therapy first. It was her way of protecting herself. That idea didn't sit well with Clint. He dismissed it outright, and with no compromise in sight, Sondra remained married on paper. Clint, meanwhile, slipped back into old habits. His attention began drifting elsewhere. By the early 1980s, Eastwood was once again juggling multiple relationships. To him, these side affairs barely seemed to matter. Animal rights activist Jane Brolin, actress Jamie Rose, and story analyst Megan Rose all passed through his life during this time. He had promised Sondra that she was the only woman he had ever been faithful to, which only made the betrayals more painful when the truth became impossible to ignore. Then came Jacqueline Reeves, a flight attendant who stood out from the rest. This relationship wasn't just another affair. Clint fell hard, and with Jacqueline, he lived a life Sandra knew nothing about. Together, Clint and Jacqueline had 2 children in secret, Scott in 1986 and Catherine in 1988. All of this happened while Clint was still living with Sandra Locke. Unlike his previous affairs, he kept this one carefully hidden. Sandra had no idea there were 2 children, and she may not have even known about Jacqueline at all. That revelation would come much later, after everything had already fallen apart. By 1989, Sandra didn't need proof of another woman to know something was wrong. The man she had fallen in love with was gone. Years of emotional neglect and mistreatment had worn her down, and she finally walked away. Since they were never married, it might have seemed like a clean break. It wasn't. Sandra underestimated just how ruthless Clint could be. At the same time, all of this was unfolding. She was managing a demanding career. She wasn't just an actress, she was one of the few female directors working in Hollywood at the time. She was in the middle of filming her second movie, Impulse, when the breakup turned ugly. One day after a long shoot, she returned home and discovered her keys no longer worked. Clint had changed the locks and moved all of her belongings into storage without warning. It was a cold, calculated move, and it sent a clear message. Any hope of a peaceful separation was gone. Sandra tried to stay professional, but Clint showed no interest in playing fair. That's when she decided to fight back. She filed a palimony lawsuit seeking compensation for the years she had spent supporting him and sacrificing her own opportunities. What she wanted was recognition and justice. What she got was humiliation. In court, Clint publicly referred to her as nothing more than a part-time roommate. It was a brutal dismissal of a relationship that had lasted more than a decade. But even that wasn't the worst of it. While the lawsuit was still ongoing, Sandra received a phone call that changed everything. An investigative journalist had tracked her down, not for an interview, but to deliver a revelation. Clint Eastwood had a secret family, and the story was about to break. The journalist explained everything. For years, Clint had been living a double life. While Sandra believed they were a committed couple, he was raising 2 children with another woman behind her back. The realization hit hard. More than betrayal, it felt like her entire reality had been a lie. As the legal battle dragged on, the situation grew even darker. Sandra was diagnosed with breast cancer. Between exhausting treatments, emotional devastation, and mounting legal pressure, she simply ran out of strength. She agreed to settle the case. The deal included a lump sum payment, monthly support, and a directing contract with Warner Brothers. Sandra had survived years of emotional damage and public humiliation. Clint, on the other hand, had already moved on. His next serious relationship began with actress Frances Fisher. They met in 1988 on the set of his comedy Pink Cadillac, well before his split with Sandra was final. At first, it was casual and non-exclusive. They didn't go public until 1990, just as Clint was closing the chapter on his legal war with Locke. Fisher believed this relationship was different. Like many before her, she thought she had found something real. But it didn't take long for the illusion to crack. The couple had a daughter, Francesca, and her birth was dramatic. Fisher went into labor 5 weeks early while staying at Clint's ranch in Northern California. She had to be airlifted by helicopter to a hospital in Redding. It was her first time giving birth, and she was terrified. While she labored through intense contractions, Clint stood at the back of the room chatting casually with the doctor about golf. At one point, a nurse approached him and quietly asked for an autograph. Fisher heard Clint say it wasn't appropriate, but he signed it anyway. Not long after leaving the hospital, Fisher had reached her breaking point. She left Clint and moved out with their newborn daughter. In hindsight, it was surprising the relationship lasted 5 years at all. The warning signs were constant. Just weeks before Francesca was born, a woman from Washington claimed Clint was her biological father, another secret child. Soon after, Fisher learned about the 2 children Clint had with Jacqueline Reeves. By 1995, Fisher finally walked away for good, but Clint didn't slow down. Before Fisher had fully moved out, he had already started seeing Dina Ruiz, a television news anchor 35 years his junior. He began appearing publicly with Dina before even announcing his breakup with Fisher. Clint and Dina married in 1996 and stayed together for nearly 2 decades. In 2012, Dina joined a reality show called Mrs. Eastwood and Company, offering a behind-the-scenes look at her life. At 81 years old, Clint was clearly uncomfortable with the spotlight that kind of show brought. The series ended in July 2012. 1 year later, the couple announced their separation. Just 2 days after that announcement, Clint was spotted with a new woman, Erica Tomlinson Fisher. Erica had recently divorced her husband, Scott Fisher, and had contacted Clint's office because she suspected Scott and Dina were having an affair. Ironically, Clint ended up dating Erica instead. Eventually, Dina did begin a relationship with Scott Fisher. They married in 2016. Clint's relationship with Erica didn't last, and by 2015, he had quietly moved on once again, this time with Christina Sandera. Things aren't looking good for Clint Eastwood. In July 2024, quiet but heartbreaking news rippled through the film world. Christina Sandera, the longtime partner of Clint Eastwood, passed away at the age of 61. Eastwood later confirmed the loss, describing her as a deeply kind and caring presence in his life, someone who meant far more to him than the public ever really saw. The two had shared nearly a decade together, choosing a life mostly away from headlines. They rarely invited attention, but from time to time they stepped into the spotlight side by side, appearing at premieres like The Mule and the 1517 to Paris. Years earlier, they had been seen together at a Sully screening in Los Angeles, and even before that, supporting an animal rescue fundraiser. These moments were brief, but they hinted at a relationship built on quiet companionship rather than Hollywood spectacle. No specific cause of death was shared at the time, but one thing was clear. Christina had been a central part of Eastwood's life during his later years. Her absence left a void that was impossible to ignore. In the months that followed, those close to Eastwood noticed a visible change. Reports suggested that his health, already fragile, appeared to decline after the loss. He was said to have lost weight, to look thinner and more worn, and to move more slowly than before. Even simple movement seemed to take effort. Friends believed the grief played a major role. Christina wasn't just a partner. She was someone he shared a rare and deeply rooted bond with. Concern grew among those around him. They worried that the loss might cause him to withdraw even further, to disappear into solitude at a moment when connection mattered most. Their hope was simple, that he would remember his life, his family, and the people who still needed him. And the timing could not have been harder. As Eastwood prepared for the release of his latest film, Juror No. 2, scheduled for late October, another crisis surfaced. His daughter, Francesca Eastwood, was arrested following an alleged altercation with her boyfriend. For Eastwood, still deep in mourning, it felt like yet another blow. Those close to him described this period as one of the lowest points he had ever faced. Grief was still raw, the loss only months old, and now he was dealing with serious family stress as well. At 94 years old, it was an overwhelming amount to carry. Even while focusing on the film's release, the situation with his daughter left him feeling unsteady and emotionally stretched. Fatherhood, however, had always mattered deeply to him. Despite everything, he remained committed to supporting Francesca as she navigated her legal troubles. At the same time, those around him emphasized that he also needed to protect his own well-being. By January 2025, signs of resilience began to show. 6 months after Christina's passing, Eastwood's son, Scott, offered a brief but reassuring update. He said his father was doing well, describing him as someone who endures, someone who keeps going no matter the circumstances. Scott pointed to their family history to explain that strength. Eastwood had grown up shaped by the Great Depression and World War II. Hardship in that household was something you faced head-on. You didn't complain. You didn't stop. You moved forward. Then, in May 2025, just ahead of his 95th birthday, Eastwood addressed lingering concerns himself. In an interview with an Austrian newspaper, he dismissed rumors about declining health and made it clear he wasn't slowing down anytime soon. He expressed confidence, even optimism, saying there was no reason a man couldn't improve with age. For Eastwood, experience hadn't dulled his edge, it had sharpened it. While others might fade, he believed he had grown stronger, wiser, and more capable than ever. After a year marked by loss, strain, and uncertainty, the message was unmistakable. The legend was still standing, still moving forward, and still very much in control of his own story.